I never thought the safest place in my life, the farm I called home, would become the setting for a secret I couldn't escape. But when my nephew looked at me that day, it wasn't just family in his eyes. It was something forbidden, something dangerous. I froze, caught between fear and a desire I hadn't felt in years. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about love. And myself. The farm had been my sanctuary for decades, a place where life moved at its own unhurried pace. After my husband passed away, I threw myself into the routines of tending to the land, hoping to fill the void left in my heart. It worked for a while. The early mornings, the smell of fresh earth, and the companionship of the animals became my solace. But as time wore on, the silence of the house grew heavier, and loneliness crept in. That's when Jimmy, my nephew, came to stay. He was in his mid-20s, strong, capable, and full of a youthful energy that seemed to breathe life back into the old farm. Having him around was a comfort, though I didn't realize just how much at first. His laughter echoed in the barn, his steady voice filled the empty kitchen, and his presence softened the sharp edges of my solitude. Jimmy wasn't just helpful, he was attentive. He noticed the small things, a loose board on the porch, my favorite tea running low, the way I rubbed my shoulder after a long day. His concern felt genuine, and for the first time in years I felt seen. It was a feeling I had nearly forgotten. Our days were filled with work, moving hay bales, feeding the animals, mending fences, and evenings brought quiet moments on the porch, where we'd watch the sun sink below the horizon. I treasured those moments, the warmth of the setting sun on my skin, the sound of crickets filling the air, and Jimmy sitting beside me, his presence a steady reassurance. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things I shouldn't. The way his shirt clung to his body after a day's work, the quiet strength in his hands as he carried heavy loads, the sparkle in his eyes when he smiled. I found myself lingering on these details longer than I should, brushing them off as harmless admiration. Yet, a quiet voice in the back of my mind warned me that something was changing, something I wasn't ready to confront. For now, I buried those thoughts deep, focusing instead on the comfort his presence brought. But deep down, I knew that life on the farm had shifted in ways I couldn't yet understand. The days began to take on a different rhythm, one where work became an excuse to stay close to Jimmy. We moved side by side through the chores, our conversations easy and filled with laughter. But beneath the surface, I started to notice subtle shifts, cracks in the familiar patterns of my life. It began with fleeting glances, moments when our eyes met and lingered a little too long. Jimmy was always kind, but his attentiveness began to feel different. He'd find reasons to stay near me, offering help even when it wasn't needed. "Let me take care of that, Aunt Sarah," he'd say, his voice warm and reassuring. But the way he looked at me, sometimes soft, almost searching, made my pulse quicken. I dismissed it as overthinking, convincing myself that I was just imagining things. Still, the signs were hard to ignore. One evening, as we worked together repairing a fence, his hand brushed against mine. It was innocent enough, but the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. I looked up, startled, to find him staring at me, his expression unreadable. My heart pounded as I quickly turned away, pretending to focus on the task at hand. Then there were the moments when he seemed to hesitate, as if on the verge of saying something important, but holding back. "Aunt Sarah," he began one night as we sat on the porch, the stars twinkling above us. His voice was low, almost hesitant, but before he could continue, he shook his head and forced a smile. "Never mind. It's nothing." The unease inside me grew. I started questioning my own feelings, trying to untangle the confusion in my heart. Was I imagining the way his hand lingered on my shoulder when he passed behind me in the kitchen? The way his laughter softened when he spoke to me? I told myself it was all in my head, that these were normal gestures of affection between family. But the way my stomach fluttered at his touch betrayed me. I also noticed a shift in myself. I began paying more attention to my appearance, brushing my hair a little longer, choosing clothes that flattered me. It was subtle, changes I justified as wanting to feel good about myself, but deep down I knew better. The mirror didn't lie. There was a spark in my eyes that hadn't been there in years, and it terrified me. One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the memories of the day replayed in my mind. The way Jimmy had smiled at me over dinner, the way his voice had softened when he said my name, it all felt too significant to ignore. I turned over, burying my face in the pillow, trying to silence the emotions swirling inside me. But the truth was undeniable. Something was happening between us, something I couldn't explain but also couldn't stop. By the time morning came, I had resolved to distance myself, to create some space and restore the boundaries that had always been there. But as I walked into the kitchen, Jimmy was already there, his smile lighting up the room. "Good morning," he said, his voice filled with warmth. And just like that, all my resolve melted away. I told myself it was nothing, that these were fleeting feelings brought on by loneliness and proximity. But as the days passed and the tension between us grew, I began to wonder if I was lying to myself. Was this truly nothing? Or was it the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face? It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, but the moments between Jimmy and me began to carry an unspoken weight. Each day, the air between us grew thicker, charged with a tension neither of us could acknowledge out loud. I told myself to keep my distance, to focus on the tasks at hand, but the pull toward him was undeniable, as if some invisible force kept drawing us closer. One afternoon, as we worked by the barn, the sun high in the sky, Jimmy caught my eye. His shirt was damp with sweat, clinging to his muscular frame, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. He smiled at me, that easy, boyish grin that always made my heart flutter, and I quickly turned my gaze to the ground, pretending to busy myself with the hay bales. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "Something on your mind?" I shook my head, forcing a smile. "Just tired," I replied, avoiding his eyes. But I knew he could see through me. He always could. Later that evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jimmy leaned closer than usual, his arm brushing against mine. The warmth of his skin sent a jolt through me, and I felt my breath hitch. He didn't move away, and neither did I. Instead, we sat there, side by side, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "Aunt Sarah," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know how to say this, but I feel like things have changed between us." I turned to look at him, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you. You're all I think about." His voice was thick with emotion, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a vulnerability that took my breath away. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was spinning, a whirlwind of confusion and emotions I had tried so hard to suppress. "Jimmy, we can't," I began, but my voice faltered as he reached out and gently took my hand in his. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I can't help how I feel. And I think you feel it too." I tried to pull my hand away, but his grip was firm, not forceful but steady, as if he was afraid to let go. I looked down at our hands, my heart racing, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel it. The connection, the warmth, the undeniable chemistry that had been building between us. "It doesn't matter what I feel," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't right." "But it's real," he countered, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "And I don't want to pretend it isn't anymore." I couldn't argue with him because deep down, I knew he was right. The feelings I had tried so hard to bury were rising to the surface, undeniable and impossible to ignore. But the weight of what we were risking, the boundaries we were crossing, was overwhelming. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances, lingering touches, and moments that felt charged with an electricity neither of us could control. One evening, as we worked in the orchard picking the last of the season's apples, Jimmy reached out to steady me as I climbed down from the ladder. His hands gripped my waist, strong and steady, and when I looked down at him, I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. "Be careful," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't want you getting hurt." I nodded, unable to speak, and as he helped me to the ground, his hands lingered on my waist for just a moment too long. I stepped back, trying to create space between us, but the tension was palpable. That night, as we sat by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting shadows on the walls, Jimmy moved closer. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I don't want to fight it anymore." I stared at him, my heart pounding, and before I could think of a response, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a soft, tentative kiss. It was like a spark igniting a fire, and in that moment, all the reasons why this was wrong melted away. I pulled back, my mind racing, but the look in his eyes, filled with longing and something deeper, kept me rooted in place. "Jimmy, we can't do this," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "I don't want to stop," he said simply, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from my face. And as he leaned in again, capturing my lips in a kiss that was both tender and filled with passion, I realized I didn't want to stop either. The line we crossed that night couldn't be undone. Each kiss, Each touch felt like an unraveling, pulling apart the fabric of the life I'd so carefully built. Jimmy's lips were soft yet insistent, and every brush of his fingers against my skin awakened feelings I hadn't felt in years. But as the heat of the moment subsided, reality came crashing down like a cold wave. We sat on the edge of the bed in silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Jimmy reached for my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles against my palm. "I don't regret this," he said softly, his voice steady. Not for a second. I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. My mind raced with thoughts of what we'd done, what it meant, and what would happen if anyone found out. "Jimmy, it's not just about us. People wouldn't understand." "I don't care what people think," he replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I care about you." His words hung in the air, but they did little to ease the weight in my chest. "It's not that simple," I whispered, pulling my hand away and standing to face the window. The moonlight spilled into the room, casting long shadows that mirrored the doubts swirling in my mind. Jimmy stood, closing the distance between us. "I know it's not simple, Aunt Sarah," he said, his voice low but firm. "But I've never felt this way before. Not about anyone." I turned to him, tears welling in my eyes. "This can't work, Jimmy. We're family." He took a step closer, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. "You feel it too." "I know you do," he said, his eyes searching mine. "You can't deny what's between us." I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the truth was I couldn't deny it. The way my heart raced when he was near, the way his touch sent shivers down my spine, it was all too real. But that didn't make it right. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. We tried to go back to the way things were, but the connection between us was impossible to ignore. Every stolen glance, every accidental brush of our hands felt like a spark, reigniting the fire we had tried to extinguish. One evening, as we worked together in the barn, I felt his eyes on me. I turned to find him standing there, watching me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "Jimmy, we can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to stop," he said, stepping closer. "And I don't think you do either." Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. I turned to the barn door, my heart racing. It was Mrs. Hawkins, our neighbor, stopping by to drop off some supplies. Her timing was impeccable, but it only served as a stark reminder of the world beyond the farm, a world that wouldn't understand what was happening between us. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind was a storm of guilt, desire, and fear. I thought about my late husband, about the life we'd built together, and the promises I'd made to him. But then I thought about Jimmy, his kindness, his laughter, the way he made me feel alive again. The conflict tore at me, and I didn't know which side would win. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Jimmy and I were sitting on the porch, the air between us tense but charged. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice steady. "We can't keep pretending nothing's changed." I nodded, my throat dry. "I know," I replied, my voice barely audible. "But what do we do? How do we move forward?" "We move forward together," he said simply, his eyes filled with determination. "No matter what." His words filled me with equal parts hope and dread. Could we really do this? Could we face the world together, despite the judgment and the consequences? Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps startled us both. I turned to see Mrs. Hawkins standing at the edge of the porch, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice hesitant. I thought I'd return your pie dish." The tension in the air was palpable, and I could see the questions in her eyes. Had she seen something? Heard something? The fear of discovery gripped me, and I forced a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins," I said, taking the dish from her hands. "That's very kind of you." She nodded, her gaze lingering on Jimmy for a moment before she turned and walked away. As she disappeared down the driveway, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. The reality of what we were risking hit me like a freight train. "Jimmy, this has to stop," I said, turning to him. "We can't keep doing this. It's too dangerous." His face fell, but he nodded. "I understand," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But that doesn't change how I feel." The days that followed were filled with a strained silence. We avoided each other as much as possible, each of us trying to navigate the impossible situation we'd found ourselves in. But no matter how hard we tried, the connection between us remained, a constant, unrelenting pull. The climax came one night when the tension finally reached its breaking point. Jimmy knocked on my bedroom door, his expression filled with a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't pretend like this doesn't matter." I stared at him, my heart racing. "Jimmy, please." Before I could finish, he stepped forward, taking my face in his hands. "I love you," he said, his voice filled with raw emotion. "I've tried to fight it, but I can't. And I don't think you can either." Tears streamed down my face as I looked into his eyes, the weight of his words crashing down on me. "I love you too," I whispered, my voice breaking. "But it's not that simple." "It doesn't have to be," he said, pulling me into his arms. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The night after our confession, everything seemed to change. The farm, once a place of routine and safety, now felt like a stage where secrets lurked in every shadow. Jimmy and I tried to keep our distance, but the line we'd crossed had forever shifted the boundaries between us. The guilt weighed on me heavily, yet the thought of losing what we'd found made it impossible to fully let go. The first ripple of consequences came sooner than I expected. Mrs. Hawkins, our ever-watchful neighbor, began stopping by more frequently. Her visits seemed casual on the surface, dropping off vegetables, asking about the farm, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes. She noticed the way Jimmy and I avoided eye contact when she was around, the way we seemed to stiffen in her presence. I told myself it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew she suspected something. It wasn't long before whispers began to spread. The local store clerk greeted me with a knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. A passing comment from another neighbor, "You and Jimmy seem awfully close these days," was delivered with a tone that made my stomach churn. I tried to brush it off, but the looks, the half-hidden smirks, and the murmured conversations were impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as Jimmy and I worked in the orchard, he stopped mid-task, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I can't stand this," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "The way people look at us, the things they're saying, it's driving me crazy." I sighed, setting down the basket of apples. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, Jimmy. People were always going to talk." "It's more than talk," he said, stepping closer. "They're judging you. I see it every time you walk into town. It's not fair." His concern warmed my heart, but it also deepened my guilt. "It doesn't matter what they think," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my words. "What matters is that we know the truth." "But what is the truth?" he asked, his voice low. "That we've found something real, or that we're risking everything for something people will never understand." His words hung in the air, and I had no answer. The truth was, I didn't know what we were doing anymore. All I knew was that being with Jimmy made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. But at what cost? The turning point came one evening when Mrs. Hawkins arrived unannounced. She stood on the porch, her expression stern, holding a pie dish I hadn't realized I'd left at her house. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice curt. I nodded, my heart pounding as I led her to the kitchen. Jimmy lingered in the doorway, his presence a silent reassurance. Mrs. Hawkins set the dish on the counter and turned to me, her gaze piercing. "Sarah," she began, her voice low but firm. "You know I don't like to meddle, but people are talking. And what they're saying, it isn't good." I felt my cheeks flush with heat, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "I don't know what you mean," I said, forcing a smile that felt hollow. "You do," she replied, her eyes narrowing. "Jimmy's a fine young man, but he's your nephew. People are starting to wonder about the two of you." The silence that followed was deafening. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Jimmy stepped forward then, his voice steady. "We don't owe anyone an explanation," he said, his tone calm but firm. "What happens here is our business, not theirs." Mrs. Hawkins looked at him, her expression a mix of shock and disapproval. "Be careful," she warned, her voice sharp. "Secrets like this don't stay hidden for long. And when they come out, they destroy everything." She left without another word, the screen door slamming behind her. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I felt tears sting my eyes. "She's right," I said, my voice breaking. "This can't stay hidden forever." Jimmy stepped closer, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. "Let them talk," he said softly. "Let them judge. None of it matters as long as we have each other." But it wasn't that simple. The whispers grew louder, the stares more pointed. Friends I'd known for years began to distance themselves, their polite smiles masking the judgment in their eyes. The isolation was suffocating, and the pressure began to take its toll. Jimmy tried to shield me from it, standing by my side through every awkward encounter and whispered remark. But the strain was undeniable. We fought more often, our arguments fueled by frustration and fear. "Why do you care so much about what they think?" he demanded one evening, his voice filled with hurt. Because I have to live here. I shouted back, tears streaming down my face. This is my home, Jimmy. My life. And it's falling apart. He looked at me then, his expression filled with pain. I never wanted to hurt you, he said softly. I thought we could be happy. I did too, I whispered, my voice trembling. But I don't know if we can. The days that followed were filled with an unbearable tension. The weight of our choices pressed down on us, and I began to wonder if the love we'd found was worth the price we were paying. But even as doubt consumed me, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. The days on the farm stretched long and heavy as Jimmy and I tried to find a way forward. The love that had once felt like a lifeline now weighed on us like a burden, strained by the whispers and judgment of the outside world. Every glance, every touch was laced with both longing and guilt. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now we were left to navigate the wreckage. I spent sleepless nights questioning everything, my choices, my feelings, and the life I had built. The farm had always been my sanctuary, but now it felt like a cage, its walls closing in on me with every passing day. I thought about Jimmy, the way he had brought laughter and light back into my life, and I couldn't imagine losing that. Yet I couldn't ignore the storm we had stirred, the way it threatened to uproot everything we held dear. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jimmy found me sitting on the porch. He approached slowly, his expression a mix of determination and sorrow. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but soft. I nodded, bracing myself for what was to come. He sat beside me, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze fixed on the fading light. "About us. About what this has done to you." I turned to him, my chest tightening. "Jimmy, you don't have to." "I do," he interrupted gently, his eyes meeting mine. "I love you, Sarah. I love you more than I ever thought possible. But I see what this is doing to you, to your life. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." Tears filled my eyes as I reached for his hand. "You're not the reason," I said, my voice trembling. This is something we both chose." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know. But I also know that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the world doesn't let people like us have what we want." The truth of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we could fight for what we had, but deep down, I knew he was right. The love we shared was real, but the cost was too high. It wasn't just the judgment of others. It was the weight of our own guilt, the way it had seeped into every corner of our lives. "I don't want to lose you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "But I don't know how to hold on." Jimmy leaned closer, his hand cupping my cheek. "You'll never lose me," he said softly. "No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. But maybe we need to let this go, for both our sakes." The words were like a knife to my heart, but I couldn't deny their truth. As much as I loved him, as much as I wanted to hold on, I knew that the life we had created was unsustainable. We sat there in silence, the weight of our decisions settling over us like a heavy blanket. In the days that followed, Jimmy began to make preparations to leave the farm. He insisted on staying long enough to ensure I was set for the coming season, repairing the fences, restocking supplies, and making sure everything was in order. His presence was a bittersweet comfort, a reminder of what we were giving up. The morning he left was quiet, the sky overcast and gray. We stood by the old truck, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. He pulled me into a tight embrace, his hand stroking my hair as I clung to him. "I'll always love you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll love you too," I replied, my tears soaking into his shirt. "Always." As he drove away, the loneliness I had tried so hard to escape returned with a vengeance. But this time it was different. This time it was tinged with a strange sense of peace. Jimmy and I had shared something rare, something beautiful, but we had also learned that love, no matter how deep, couldn't exist in a vacuum. It needed space to breathe, to grow, and sometimes that meant letting it go. Over time, the whispers faded, and life on the farm returned to its steady rhythm. The pain of losing Jimmy lingered, but it became a part of me, a reminder of the love that had once brought me back to life. I carried it with me, not as a burden, but as a lesson, a reminder of the fragility of human connections and the strength it takes to let go. And as the seasons changed, I found a new kind of solace. The farm, once a symbol of isolation, became a place of reflection and renewal. I learned to find joy in the simple things again: the warmth of the sun on my skin, the sound of the wind in the trees, and the memories of a love that, though fleeting, had left an indelible mark on my soul. If you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Could love ever justify crossing such forbidden boundaries? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that challenge the limits of love, loyalty, and morality. And stay tuned. Our next story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about relationships.